This video contains spoilers for Splatoon 3 story mode. If this isn't your cup of tea, now's your time to leave. You ready? We all saw it happen, right? We trekked, we fought, and journeyed, only to find a shell, a husk of what was. Everyone mourns the loss of their beloved. One even sheds a tear. Everyone but this octoling right here. This is the look of an octoling who doesn't give two squids about this old hag. How dare he talk bad about Octarians, as if the ones saving them weren't one themselves. But that's only part of the reason for their half-empathetic poker face. The main cause behind it is because they know the truth. And the truth? This old man isn't dead. Okay, that is a huge claim, but hear them out. Hear me out. I was curious on what being splatted means in Splatoon. I have a video on my findings, but what really stuck out to me was what happened to Captain Cuttlefish towards the end of Return of the Mammalians. What happened to Captain was a shock, but since it seemed he was fine moments later, I, and most likely other players too, brushed it off. He brushed the dust of what happened off and continued with the game as if nothing happened. Nowadays, after my recent peak of interest, his death confuses me. It was never explicitly stated that he died, and it bothered me. Not as in he should have died, but it makes me ask, did he ever die in the first place? This vague possibility needed explaining, and after plenty of reaching and stretching, I now have an explanation to this pitiful thought of mine. The dust of this event can't sit in a corner for much longer. This is the Shell City theory. As we know, Captain Cuttlefish died in the story mode due to being dehydrated by Mr. Grizz. This unfortunate event leads me to believe one of the many ways an inkfish can truly cease to be is to quite literally dry out. For context, I use the term inkfish the same way Flo uses it, to refer to beings like inklings, octolings, and in this case, cuttlefish. This way of death is something I'd personally say is realistic. Seeing how fish really do die from dehydration and how it's made into such a big deal in the Rise of the Mammalians, I can't find anything that would deem it unreasonable. I would have loved to end this theory here, but what happens next urges me to dive deeper. Captain 3 sheds a tear and revives Captain Cuttlefish. See, the fact that Captain was able to come back to life makes me doubt if he were truly gone. I doubt it because of the mere existence of respawning. Let's take a step back and define what respawning is. It's a simple answer technically, dying and coming back to life. But there's more that goes into it than just that. First, in order to respawn at all, we all know what we have to do. Whether it's by exploding into enemy ink, dissolving in a body of water, or literally turning into colored air, your body is destroyed and a ghost is released. This part of respawning is extremely relevant to this theory, so let's put a pin in it so we can remember. Next, this ghost, or soul as I may call it for the rest of the video, floats up and out of the screen. At this point, we can't see what happens to it, but we can assume that it returns to a spawn point. This can be seen in battles, during recon mode, in every story campaign, and even in Salmon Run. This is another point to remember, so I'll pin it too. Finally, after a ghost makes its way to a spawn point, it can regenerate back into its inky self. Notice how an inkfish's body has to rebuild itself back to its normal state. This growing mechanism can also give us insight on how the transformation from squid to kid works. The main point to remember, and the final pin, is that once a soul reaches a spawn point, it regenerates using the surrounding ink to regrow its body. Now that we have an explanation of the respawning process, Let's connect it back to Captain Cuttlefish. As we saw before, we found Captain's dehydrated body at the top of the rocket. Assuming he was dead, he should go through the steps of respawning. Let's bring out our first pin. If you are splatted by any means, your body is destroyed and a ghost or soul is released. Inklings and Octolings respawn because our bodies disappear. They explode, they dissolve, they dissipate, and the release of their ghosts allows them to eventually respawn. But we found Captain Cuttlefish's body on the ground. If he were truly splatted by dehydration, why is he still here? His body couldn't have been a hallucination. Captain 3 is able to touch, hold, and eventually cry onto him. Due to these circumstances alone, he couldn't have started the process of respawning. His body hasn't been destroyed, and his soul is most likely still in it. The fact that Captain Cuttlefish is still here in his grand dehydrated glory should be enough to prove that he hasn't died, but let's say his soul was released from his body either way. To bring up and combine our second and third pins, when Captain's soul was released from his body, it should have made its way to a respawn point. And when it made its way to a respawn point, it should have used surrounding ink to rebuild its body. When Captain Cuttlefish was revived, did his soul suddenly return to his body through Captain 3's tear? That would mean his body in that moment of time was a respawn point, and Captain 3's tear was the ink that allowed him to regrow his body. The argument that Captain Cuttlefish's body was a respawn point is lightly debunked by the fact that we never saw his soul move back into him, the same way we see with other spawn points. The argument that Captain 3's tear allowed him to regrow his body, though, is something to remember. Regardless, Captain's body didn't regrow like we see with other inkfish. It was only resaturated. His body was revamped, if you will, seeing how it stayed in its shrunken state. And with that, I have my final argument. Captain Cuttlefish was not dead at the top of the rocket. If he were, he should have gone through the steps of respawning, but he couldn't, due to the fact that his soul was never released, his soul never reached a spawn point, and since an ink source wasn't nearby, he could not have reformed his body. So, good for him, I guess. But if he didn't die, what happened to him? And outside of that, why is this theory called the Shell City theory? Well, the answer to those can be answered with this. Do you remember the first SpongeBob SquarePants movie? That's right. The name of this theory is derived from a little place called Shell City Marine Gifts and Sundries, a gift shop shown in the year 2000's film, The SpongeBob SquarePants Movie. What happens at the climax of this movie is key in explaining what happened to Captain Cuttlefish. Let's look back at these scenes and see if we can make some connections. SpongeBob and Patrick get caught by the villain and are laid out under a heat lamp. The heat lamp dries all the water out of their bodies and they shrivel up and become unresponsive. Their final tears trail down to an outlet and causes the heat lamp to short circuit. Its smoke triggers the sprinklers inside the building. Fortunately, some of the water droplets land on them and they poof back to their normal selves. Great! Captain gets caught by Mr. Grizz and his brain is extracted for essence and expertise. The process causes him to dehydrate, and he falls into the state the agents found him in. While mourning the presumed loss of their former leader, Captain 3 sheds a single tear. It falls and lands on Captain's body. The tear provided just enough moisture for his color to return and for his eyes to open. Are you seeing why I call this the Shell City theory now? SpongeBob, Patrick, and all the other fish in the gift shop too were thought to be dead from dehydration, but just a few drops of water brought them back. Everyone thought Captain Cuttlefish had passed, but all it took was a drop of water, or whatever inkfish tears are made of, to bring him back. Don't you see it? Captain Cuttlefish, SpongeBob, Patrick, and everyone were never dead. They were only in a state of dormancy. I have all the pieces needed to complete the puzzle of Captain Cuttlefish's death, and to define what the Shell City, or better yet, the death by dehydration theory truly is. After being used by Mr. Grizz, Captain Cuttlefish was most likely left to die. He got what he needed, and his victim was left in a state of dormancy due to dehydration. The agents found him, but it seemed he was gone for good. Heartbroken, Captain 3 holds the body of their former mentor. They can't help but shed a tear. Luckily for the agents, the fallen tear was just enough to kick him out of his dormant state. Damage was done, but at least the agents had their beloved ex-captain back. An inkfish that has been dehydrated shrivels up and loses their color. If rehydrated in a short amount of time, the color will return, but their form will most likely be stuck in a smaller size. If a dehydrated inkfish goes without rehydrating for too long, they will become stagnant and eventually die. Okay, that's a wrap.
Mason out.
How in the world did I connect Splatoon to SpongeBob? Out of everything. That's so dumb. That's so dumb. Why did I think of this?